Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. Please stand by for Robert Wenzel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. I'm Robert Wenzel. My guest today is Richard Ebeling. Dr. Ebeling is currently a professor of economics at Northwood University in Midland, Michigan. He's the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He has written and edited numerous books, including a 3-volume selected writings of Ludwig von Mises. Most recently, he's written Political Economy, Public Policy, and Monetary Economics, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian Tradition, Austrian Economics and the Political Economy of Freedom. Richard is probably best known for having discovered the lost papers of Ludwig von Mises, a formerly secret archive in the Soviet Union. I've had Richard on the show before. It was an awesome interview, and I welcome him back. Richard, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Robert.
You know, I tell you, in preparing for this interview, I listened again to the first interview I had with you, and it was absolutely awesome. I was really impressed. It was over a year and a half ago, and it's as timely today as it was a year and a half ago. You didn't miss a step as to sort of trends that might be developing and stuff like that. They're still all sort of in motion. So what I'm going to do is link at the bottom of the post to this interview, your last interview, so people can sort of have a sense of the series of our talks, because I don't want to go over the same material that I did last time. But this time you emailed me and you told me you were in China and you got mugged. So tell me about that and tell me your impressions of China.
Well, I was sent over by Northwood University to do a rather intense 1-week course on the philosophy of American free enterprise at a university not far from Shanghai that Northwood has an educational relationship with. Some of those Chinese students come over to Northwood here in Michigan to finish their undergraduate degree. And I had arrived in Shanghai, checked into my hotel, had a meal, and decided to walk through the historical European part of Shanghai. And it was around 9:30 at night, and came to a side street, and 3 fellows on motorbikes knocked me over. One of them held me down. The other started rummaging through my pant pockets and found a whole bunch of cash, unfortunately. Was quite happy, waved it at his 2 buddies, and they immediately got on their motorbikes and disappeared into the night. I can assure you I was rather shaken up, but I suppose that's one of the adventures of life.
Yeah. You know, you have to do what I do, Richard. I carry around what I call mugger's money. I get some old Zimbabwe, or what I like to use is Yugoslavian and German marks from their hyperinflations, which have, you know, tons of zeros on them. 10 million this and 10 million that. And when someone gets near me, because I like to take walks late at night, and sometimes it can be pretty dangerous out there, because I tend to be in major cities, and if something looks dangerous, I just give the guys, 10 million German marks, and they're pretty happy with it. Probably not so in the morning.
Carry some duplicates of old Confederate money.
Yeah, there you go. So, anyways, so what about China itself? What was your impression there?
Well, I had an opportunity to look through Shanghai a bit, and then this university is located about an hour and a half west of Shanghai in a city called Wuxi, which actually since the 1930s has been an industrial center for China. And what struck me, of course, what strikes the visitor first, the sky filled with construction cranes. The amount of building construction is immense for both business and residential manufacturing. And one has this impression of this futuristic architecture, and that China is accelerating into the 21st century after centuries of poverty and agricultural low standards of living. And of course, a lot of that is true. The fact is, since these reforms were introduced in China, beginning especially in the 1980s, there has been a dramatic increase and improvement in the standards of living of hundreds of millions of China's 1.3 billion people. But when you look beneath the surface and you talk to people there and you observe things, even for a short period of time, you realize that this is a construction boom on a foundation of sand. You pass row after row after row of skyscraper apartment complexes that have been built in the last few years. And you notice at night there's no lights on, and you talk to people who are in the know, And they tell you that this has all been a construction speculative bubble in which 80 to 90% of the apartment spaces in this vast expansion is empty, unlet, unowned, basically because they've been built with funding from the banks directed by the government to make these loans, supplied through a huge increase in the Chinese money supply over the last, let's say, 7, 8, 10 years. The impression that I had, but looking beneath the surface, talking to people, observing, is that what many observers have suggested is really fundamentally true, and that is, without being able to time it next week, next month, 2 years from now, I don't see how China is not going to go through a major bursting of this bubble. They're going to go through a housing recession, if not depression, a falling off of related manufacturing construction in a major way. And the authorities in Beijing will try to manipulate the monetary and fiscal tools like they were doing while we were hit by the recession a few years ago. But I'm persuaded that they easily could face a stark reality similar to what Japan has been through for the last several decades when their bubble burst back in the 1980s. And given that they're an authoritarian regime and a lot of unrest and frustrations among the general population, I think this is going to be a very difficult thing for the Communist Party officials to keep under control. And how it will play out, the fact is that history follows its own course, but I think it's going to be very messy and very disruptive and chaotic.
Yeah. Were you able to get any sense at all as to the amount of price inflation going on in the country? Was anybody talking about that or indicating concern?
But you do talk to people is that, again, it's sort of the same type of illusion that we've been suffering in the United States, with the official government statistics saying that inflation in terms of price inflation is moderate, not serious. But you talk to people there, what has happened to the cost of food? What has happened to the cost of everyday amenities? The cost of gasoline, of buying a car? And you realize that the official statistics are hiding a significant rise in prices. People would tell me 10%, 15%, looking over a year and a half period. So, in fact, the monetary expansion that's been going on over the last 7 or 8 years is bringing about the inevitable pressure on prices in a significant way.
Were you able to get the sense of how much and I realize you were there for a very short period of time, but any sense at all as to how much is centrally controlled by the government, how much free market operations are allowed?
Clearly, virtually nothing happens of any economic significance that does not require connections, special friends at both the municipal and the provincial and at the national level. The intertwining of politics and the market is extremely tight. So again, you have this veneer of market relationships, businesses. See, this is another thing, is that, for example, they have built this entire shopping and restaurant area in this industrial city of Wuxi, where you walk down this avenue located near the old famous Grand Canal that connected from Beijing down to the Yangtze River. They built it near the old historical Grand Canal. And it's just one restaurant after another. And all of this has been centrally planned. They can just design the construction of what businesses should exist, where they should exist. And again, it's the central planner's mentality. Don't build what people need and want, where they would like to do the shopping, but all the restaurants should be in the same place. All of the boutiques should be in the same place. It's both an imbalanced and lopsided, misdirected investment in enterprises. So you have all of these done with government connections, government money, government bribes, businessmen thinking they're having opportunities. Some, I'm sure, having done initially very successfully with these connections and opportunities. But all of it is so misplaced and mismatched and twisted and misdirected that all of this is going to be a major falling off because of the politicization of whatever market-type relationships exist there, that when this housing crash comes, I really think that complementary to it is going to be a collapse of all of these related imbalances and distortions of the rest of what on the surface seems like a market relationship, but really is a politicized direction of economic activity in just a different form than the old-fashioned central planning.
Did you see any poverty at all? Was there much poverty around?
Of course, in the manufacturing and industrial areas, it sucked people into urban life, and you have a sense that there is a significant middle class. Again, on this sort of foundation of uncertain sand, who live, in a sense, like we do. I mean, you walk down through the streets of Shanghai or Wuxi, And the women are fashionably dressed as if you were seeing women in London or New York or Paris. Every conceivable Western or Chinese version of a Western store is there filled with these goods. But you also have a sense that if you pass by and see parts of the countryside, particularly in the most rural areas, there is a huge percentage of the population, the majority of the population, who are still very far from having any significant benefits of the reforms that have touched a noticeable but still a minority percentage of the population.
Was this your first trip to China? Have you ever been to China before?
No, this is actually the first opportunity that I've had to spend in China itself. As you mentioned, I'm a professor at Northwood University. I'm an economist. That was my major beginning when I was an undergraduate. But my minor was history, especially focusing on modern Chinese history, 19th and 20th century history. So in a sense, I had an historical perspective from my studies over the years of sort of knowing the type of thing to look for, the places to look for. And so, yes, I was a novice in the sense that was my first visit, but I would like to think that I was trying to look at it with a bit of an historical informed eye.
Okay, let's test your informed eye back here in the United States. What kind of thoughts do you have on the president's inaugural speech?
Of course, there's several dimensions to this, including the president's just recent statement in his brief inaugural address. First of all, there's the monetary dimension. As I'm sure many of our listeners follow, and I'm sure you've talked about, is the fact that Ben Bernanke has made this announcement that for the foreseeable future, at least for this coming year, between mortgage-backed securities that the Fed will buy up, as well as U.S. securities, they're going to be increasing the money supply by an average around $85 billion a month. They can't pay for the government securities or the mortgages other than by creating money. Well, you multiply $85 billion times 12, and you're talking about the Federal Reserve in this coming year expanding the money supply by over $1 trillion, which means that if the federal government runs a deficit, again, of approximately $1 trillion, the Federal Reserve will have monetized dollar for dollar everything that the government has to borrow. This is threatening an underlying eventual burst of serious price inflation and wobbling and threat to the currency, even worse than has been up to now. On the fiscal side, this whole issue that the fact is that neither Democrats nor Republicans, in spite of their respective rhetorics, are not really interested in dealing with what is the major problem. As Milton Friedman always emphasized, it's not the taxing that tells you the cost of government or even the amount that is borrowed that is the cost of government. It's the two of them combined, which represents total government expenditures on a regular basis. And the federal government is spending between $3.5 and $4 trillion a year, of which a large part is borrowed money. And it is this unwillingness, the unwillingness to accept the fact that this is not only unsustainable, but to have to rethink what is the legitimate and appropriate functions of a government in what is supposed to be a free society. So many people are on the take in the sense of receiving government largesse in the form of this government program, this subsidy, this regulatory benefit, as well as politicians who only get elected by promising their constituents things and not giving them bad news that the money's going to have to dry up, that is just pushing us to these continuing unsustainable levels of both spending and debt and taxation. And then the president has basically laid down the gauntlet in his inaugural statements the other day, where he basically has said it's ridiculous for anyone to debate about the legitimate role of government. The legitimate role of government. That has to be put aside, and that the real issues have to be dealt with, and that is more government entitlement programs, more government spending, more government regulation. In other words, he's basically saying, roll over, play dead, whoever you are in the United States. We are in charge, and we're going to make this an even larger entitlement, welfare, paternalistic state, because we know what's good for you better than yourself. And if anybody gets in the way, we will use the political rhetoric and the political muscle to run roughshod over any representatives in Congress who attempt to oppose it, or to prevent any groups in society who are suspicious and are angry about the tax, regulatory, and spending burdens that the government is placing upon our American economy. These are dangerous times for this country, both politically and economically, in my view. What is going to be the end result of this?
So, Richard, you talked about what the end result might be. I mean, do you see a major collapse of the United States economy? Do you see the possibility of civil unrest? What do you think might happen?
There's several dimensions of our dilemma. One is just sort of the nuts and bolts of the size and the pervasiveness of government in our society. We do have a problem, as the data and the analysts have pointed out. We have a situation where close to 50% of the population receives a portion or all of their income through some form of federal government redistributive program. This creates a huge spider's web of special interest groups, and not just the image of someone on welfare. We're also talking about crony capitalism, welfare for business special interests, and so on. Such a spider's web of special interest groups, each of whom would have to take such a concentrated short-run hit if government spending was to be reduced, spending financed either through taxes or through borrowing, that each special interest group will have a strong incentive for it and in coalition with others to fight tooth and nail to prevent any such cutback. Which means that one scenario, nobody has a crystal ball to know how history will play out. That's one of the surprises and unpredictability of history. But the fact is, one scenario is that this could continue for a period of time, again, unspecified because nobody can know that. And the end road would be a situation similar to what we've seen as the fiscal and financial crises of a number of European countries, such as Greece or Spain or Portugal or Italy. The other element, the most fundamental thing here, and that is that there has to be a serious and articulated and principled discussion and debate with our fellow Americans to get them to refocus on the issue of what is it that are the legitimate functions of a limited government in a free society. And for Americans to want to, even if it involves some short-run pain, and even if it involves impacting upon them, to at least to be willing to bite the bullet and to move in that direction. Neither the Democrats want a bigger government, and the Republicans, who supposedly talk about restraining government, talk about, saving the entitlement programs, running them in a more efficient way, finding some fiscal stability to them. The more fundamental issue, if this is going to be reversed, is the type of political and ideological shift, which does not happen overnight, but is inevitable if a change is going to occur that's solid and sound. That the issue is it the role of government to be supplying these entitlement programs to people, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and the whole potpourri of food stamps and public housing. Because unless that is handled, there is no way to do this. We see this situation in Europe. They have found it necessary to have to cut back what they're calling austerity, which more than anything else is reducing the rate at which government spends, not cutting government. But they're all doing it grudgingly because they believe that government should do this, both for philosophical, ideological reasons and pragmatic politics. But it will just continue again once some type of financial crisis situation sort of dies down. And it's the same dilemma in the United States. This requires a sea change in the fundamental ideas upon this country is founded. That falls upon each and every one of us who believe in liberty, who care about the sanctity of the individual, on a society of free and voluntary relationships in which people have the freedom and the responsibility and the opportunity to make their own decisions. We have to present this as a positive, desirable, and moral vision and foundation for our country. Otherwise, we'll just go from crisis to crisis, and each one will get worse. And at some point, as the old song says, something's got to give.
Yeah. How optimistic or pessimistic are you? And is it a case where we have to sort of get, the masses to understand liberty and how important that is? Or can we get away with 10% of the sort of thinking people who follow politics and government closely and sort of get them thinking in terms of liberty? What's your thought on that?
Well, I'm always reluctant to be excessively pessimistic, because if you look over the last about 100 years before the First World War, everybody in 1913 would have basically said, a world war is impossible. This isn't an order or stability of the world that will endure forever. Next year, war breaks out. Then World War I occurs, and the European structure of power collapses, and fascism and Nazism and communism arise. And everybody says, well, you see, this is the end of democracy. How can we ever resist this totalitarianism? It's the wave of the future. And then Nazism and fascism die in World War II, and then in the post-war period, you have people saying, well, communism is inevitable, that the Soviets will win. Well, they disappeared from the map in 1991. So again, we have this fiscal and financial and monetary crisis. It's the end of capitalism. There's no way to reverse it. The fact is, history follows its own course, and trends do change. And nothing is ultimately inevitable. It only seems inevitable after the fact, never before, when avenues and options are open. But it does require courage, integrity, and a moral stance to stand up against bad policies, and if I can use this language, evil. And the coercive power of the state to oppress, manipulate, regulate, and control people's lives is evil. And it's not inevitable. Things can be turned around. There have been crises before, and sometimes they have been solved and reversed without collapse. But on its face, you would have to say that we're looking upon worse and more difficult times ahead before any change in those trends.
I want to shift a little bit here. Richard, I've enjoyed stories you've told me privately about different economists that you've met and known. I mean, it seems if anyone has sort of gone out of their way to really meet the top Austrian economists, from Friedrich von Hayek to Ludwig Lachmann and everybody in between, it's you. Can you tell us, one summer I believe you were in California where Hayek was also at a seminar at some institute. Can you tell us a little bit about your impressions of Hayek when you were there with him?
I had the privilege, the honor, when I was a young man in my 20s, of having 2 summer fellowships at the Institute for Humane Studies, when they were then headquartered out in Menlo Park, California, not far from Stanford. Both of those summers was a senior resident fellow. And I had the further good fortune that the office that had been assigned to me was only 1 or 2 offices down from him. And being young, brash, and perhaps not always patient, I would go in and try to talk to him every day about politics, economics, the history of the Austrian school, about his place in his historical battles against socialism, against Keynes and Keynesian economics. And I have to say is that, and I can honestly say, that as not only as a thinker, but as a human being, he was one of the most impressive individuals I ever met. He would patiently answer every question, even when the sort of brash and arrogant young man that I was would challenge him and prod him and sometimes try to contradict him. He would do so with patience and calmness and treat every question I asked, even if it was the type of question that over his long career he had heard 1,000 times, he treated each question as if he was hearing it for the first time. There was a wisdom and a sharing of knowledge and a courtesy and a politeness and an insightfulness of him that, in my opinion, makes, of the people I've met, particularly virtually all of the Austrian economists of my lifetime and many others, Friedman and others, Hayek stands out as one of the great personalities and one of the great intellects of the 20th century. Truly, if there's a sense in which someone deserved the Nobel Prize, an image of that type of person, he was truly deserving of such an international recognition for his contributions as a thinker of great profundity, insight, and power and impact.
Did he ever give you any sense of his reaction, personal reaction to winning the Nobel Prize or having to have to share it with?
He had a great modesty toward it. First of all, he had even suggested that in principle there shouldn't even be a Nobel Prize for economics because economics was totally different than the natural sciences. Of course, Hayek was a great proponent of saying that economics is a science, but a science, a human science that has qualities and characteristics very different from the natural science, physics or chemistry or biology. But he believed that there was the impression among the general public that the economist could somehow, with his mathematics and his equations and his statistical techniques, could somehow offer precision and directed construction and planning to remake society the way the natural sciences uses their knowledge and insight at an applied level to send rockets to the moon or bridges spanning rivers. And he was afraid that that could be misunderstood and abused. But I can say that he was very pleased to have this recognition. He had been in an intellectual wasteland for a long time. The fact is that after the notoriety of his wartime book, The Road to Serfdom, with the rise of Keynesianism, the strong belief in a welfare state, the challenge and seeming inevitability of socialism in many parts of the world, he fell into sort of an intellectual wasteland in which he was ignored, ridiculed, and considered having been wrong. And the Nobel Prize, in a sense, was an affirmation in which his life's work had not been for naught, if you will. And I think that he appreciated that. People who knew him well before he won the prize said that he often was introvert, sometimes depressed about the directions of the world, and his sense that his writings would have no significance or lasting value. The prize, in a sense, these people told me, before and after winning it, sort of perked him up, gave him an uplifted spirit, the result of which is that he wrote this final trilogy of law, legislation, and liberty. He wrote this book calling for the denationalization of money. He was inspired to write his final book, The Fatal Conceit, a final challenge and thrust at the socialist argument for social engineering. So in that sense, the winning the Nobel Prize was sort of like an injection in the arm of excitement to get back to his contributions and his work.
Wow. Great insight, Richard. It's always a pleasure. Enjoy talking with you. And again, thanks very much, Richard. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Bye-bye.
Okay, let's bring Chris Rossini on the line for Wrap Up with Rossini. Chris, what did you think?
Very insightful stuff, especially about Friedrich Hayek. I really enjoyed that part. With regards to China, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, recently went to North Korea. And his daughter, when they came back, wrote that it was very much like the Truman Show there. And I kind of got that impression with Dr. Ebeling's description of China, how everything it's like a big Sim City, like the video game, where, instead of the market deciding how resources are allocated, the government has a very strong influence on how that happens. And this is a worldwide phenomenon that's going on with the ideas of the role of government even here. And I'm not sure either how it's all going to play out. One thing that, if I had to guess, I have a feeling that it's going to be monetary, the crisis that occurs, because much like back when communism was taking over the world, I think it was like 65% of the world was communist at one point. Well, right now, to my knowledge, 100% of the world has some kind of central banking and controlled money. So perhaps someday, future generations will look back at our times and perhaps central banking will be gone, much like communism. Let's hope.
Yeah, let's hope. I fear it's going to be a long road. One thing I just wanted to point out with regard to Richard and his comments about Hayek, I've talked to Richard personally a number of times. It's not only Hayek. I mean, Richard's a guy that sort of aggressively gets in there and tries to understand what Austrian thinking is about. And he spent time with most of the top Austrian guys, even some that would, not be considered mainstream Austrians, Ludwig Lochmann, for example, and people like that. So, we'll have Richard on the show again and sort of drag out some more stories about other Austrians.
Yeah, and if I could add just one thing to what you mentioned earlier, when he went to the Soviet Union to get Ludwig von Mises's papers, he wasn't allowed to bring them back. So I read that he photocopied like 10,000 papers, and he was allowed to bring the photocopies back, but the originals had to stay in Russia. And that's just an amazing thing for him to go and do something like that.
Yeah, no question. I mean, it takes a Richard Ebeling kind of person who is truly dedicated and interested about Austrian economics to find, that trove in the first place. I mean, he actually, I believe he writes about this somewhere. He may have told me this in a private conversation, but he was actually touring the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and then somehow got talking to an archivist or something, and the archivist mentioned, the Soviet Union has a lot of archives that they took from the Germans, so there's a possibility that Mises's papers were in the Soviet Union, because that's how they got there. Mises left them in Austria when he left to go to Switzerland when the Germans were moving into Austria. And then it was the Germans that actually confiscated the papers from Mises' house. Mises didn't know that the Germans maintained them, and he didn't know that they ended up in the Soviet Union. So that's kind of an interesting story in itself.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
It's great that Richard was able to find that.
Yeah, we're very indebted to everything that he did.
Okay, that concludes Wrap Up with Rossini. Thanks, Chris. We'll talk to you next week.
Great, thanks again.
Thank you for listening to the Robert Wenzel Show. This is Robert Wenzel. Be sure to check out my website, economicpolicyjournal.com, where I blog 7 days a week about economics, finance, politics, and liberty. Executive producer of The Robert Wenzel Show is Chris Rossini. Head of editing and mastering is John Daubert.